Bloodborne hides things so deep in its code, its item descriptions, and its forgotten corners that most players will finish the game multiple times and never once brush against the strange, broken, and genuinely unsettling anomalies that this video is going to walk you through. I want to be upfront about something before we get into it. I put this video together because Bloodborne is a game that keeps giving, and after years of digging through playthroughs, data means, and community research, I became obsessed with the stuff that doesn't fit. The anomalies, the things that feel like mistakes but probably aren't, or things that look intentional but make no rational sense. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to lean into interpretation rather than stating things as flat fact. A lot of what we know about Bloodborne's deeper systems and unused content comes from community data mining and close reading, not from developer commentary. So when I say something suggests a certain reading, that's intentional. I'm not handing you answers. I'm handing you the same puzzle pieces I found and showing you why I think they fit the way they do. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The glitches that feel like lore. There is a specific kind of moment in Bloodborne that stops you cold. Not a boss, not a jump scare. It's when the game does something it shouldn't be able to do. When an enemy occupies a space it has no business occupying. When a door opens that was sealed a moment ago. When you fall through the floor of the nightmare and land somewhere the game's geometry tells you shouldn't exist. These moments get dismissed as bugs. But in a game where the boundary between waking and dreaming is mechanically enforced, where the architecture of certain zones literally shifts depending on your progression, calling something a bug feels like the lazy answer. Let's start with what might be the most documented and most misunderstood anomaly in Bloodborne. The Forbidden Woods walking corpse. There is a body in the Forbidden Woods that, under very specific conditions involving precise movement and camera angles near a particular slope, appears to twitch. Not the standard death animation. Not a ragdoll settling into place. Players who encountered this described it as a deliberate motion. A slow lean forward, followed by a return to stillness. For a long time this was written off as a physics engine hiccup. The community eventually determined it was likely related to the game's animation blending system, failing to fully commit to a death state. But what makes this interesting is the specific body it affects. That body is positioned near one of the Forbidden Woods' more obscure paths, one that leads toward the lecture building shortcut, the path that points toward the nightmare. That placement, intentional or not, fits the game's broader logic about the dead not quite being dead in Yharnam. The same logic applies to an anomaly in the Charnel Lane area, where if you stand in a specific corner near the second lamp and listen, you can hear what sounds like the doll's ambient prayer audio playing at a fraction of its normal volume. This has been replicated consistently enough that it isn't simple audio bleed from loading a distant asset. The audio is directional, meaning your character's position in that corner changes which ear it comes through. The doll's prayer is tied to the hunter's dream. Charnel Lane is one of the first places in the game that pushes hard on the theme of rituals performed to contact something beyond. Whether this is a deliberate environmental detail or an audio engine loading something it shouldn't load in that zone is genuinely unclear, but the fit is too clean to dismiss. Moving into the Yahargul Unseen Village, there is a well-documented but poorly explained phenomenon involving the kidnappers, the large bag-carrying enemies that can grab and transport you. Under certain conditions, if you are killed by a kidnapper while you already have a kidnapper transport queued from a previous encounter that hadn't been cleared from memory, the game will attempt to load both transport destinations simultaneously. What this produces is a loading state that places your hunter in a black void for approximately 2 to 4 seconds before resolving to the correct destination. This void is not a loading screen. The game's HUD is active. Your character has full movement inputs registered. You simply have nowhere to go. Some players have managed to capture this state and rotate the camera, finding that the void isn't entirely empty. There appear to be geometry fragments, partial assets, brief flickers of texture data that don't correspond to any known area of the game. Whether these are loading artifacts or something else is genuinely unknown. Then there is the matter of the lanterns themselves. In standard gameplay, lanterns are the safe points, the exits, the breath of fresh air in an otherwise suffocating world. But there is one lantern in the game that behaves differently from all the others. The lantern outside the entrance to the Hypogean jail, the prison in Yharnam, has a hitbox that extends roughly 40% further than any other lantern in the game. This isn't visible, obviously, but it means your activation prompt for this lantern triggers from a noticeably greater distance than any other lamp. Delta miners and speedrunners notice this because it affects optimization routes. The question that nobody has definitively answered is why. Every other lantern in the game is consistent. This one isn't. One reading is that it was intentionally extended because the approach to that lamp is so dangerous and the stakes so high that the developers wanted players to have an easier escape. Another reading is that the Hypogean jail's lantern, as a point of entry into a zone built around involuntary transportation and imprisonment, has a reach that reflects something about the nature of that space. The idea that the exit is easier to find than normal because the zone itself is so hard to leave by other means. The Chalice dungeons introduce their own category of anomalies entirely, and we could spend the entire runtime of this video just on those. But there is one Chalice dungeon anomaly that stands above the rest in terms of how disorienting it is. In root Chalice dungeons, the procedurally generated ones, there exists a tile type that is supposed to be a dead end, a room with no exits. These rooms are typically used as treasure rooms, placing a chest or a collectible at the end of a short branch. However, in documented runs of Thumaru Ihil root Chalice dungeons, with specific depth parameters, this dead-end tile has been found to spawn with a door. Not an impassable door, not a locked door, but a door that opens. Behind this door is a room that should be impossible, given the dungeon's seed. It contains no enemies, no items, and no exits, other than the door you came through. The room is perfectly constructed, lit, geometrically complete, and it contains nothing. This has been captured on video multiple times across multiple platforms. No explanation has emerged. Continuing through the Chalice dungeons, there is an anomaly that touches on something darker. The maternal remains that appear as environmental decoration throughout the Thumaru dungeons, the skeletal corpses in various stages of ritual, occasionally appear in configurations that don't match any of the dungeon's standard tile sets. Specifically, there are documented instances of a maternal corpse positioned in a doorway in a posture that suggests the corpse was placed there after the door was sealed, because the positioning only makes sense if the door was closed when the body arrived. The Chalice dungeon tile sets do not contain a placement rule that would produce this. It suggests either a very specific random generation collision, or that there is a body placement pass in the dungeon generation that runs independently of the architecture generation. If the latter is true, it means the bodies in the Chalice dungeons can end up in places the dungeon itself wasn't designed to put them. That's a small technical detail, but in a lore context, in a game about rituals gone wrong and the Great Ones warping physical space, it reads differently. The fishing hamlet contains what is arguably the most visually striking anomaly in the base game. There is a pool of water near the approach to the lighthouse hut lamp, where, under specific weather simulation, states that occur rarely and cannot be manually triggered, the reflection in the water does not match the sky above it. The sky during Bloodborne's fishing hamlet sequence is a specific shade of deep blue-grey, consistent and fixed. But in this pool, during the anomalous state, the reflection shows something brighter, almost dawn-coloured. Players who noticed this initially assumed it was a visual glitch related to the pool's shader failing to sample the correct skybox. but multiple captures of this phenomenon from different angles confirm that the reflected light has consistent directionality. It is coming from a position in the reflected sky that would correspond to a sun rising in the east. The fishing hamlet skybox has no sun. It never has one. Whatever the pool is reflecting either isn't the sky above the hamlet, or the pool's reflection is showing something the skybox is simply not displaying. One of the stranger anomalies tied to NPC behaviour involves Alfred, the hunter of vile bloods. Alfred has a fairly well-understood questline, and most players who follow it reach his final state where he can be found at the Queen's chambers after the Anomalies assassination. What is less discussed is what happens if you exhaust Alfred's dialogue in a very specific order, obtain the Radiance rune, and then return to the location where Alfred was first found before proceeding to Canehurst. Under these conditions, Alfred's initial spawn point at the Cathedral Ward sometimes contains an extra item that is not present in a standard playthrough. The item is a pebble. This is not a unique pebble. It has no special properties. It is a pebble, but it should not be there. Alfred does not drop pebbles. No enemy near that location drops pebbles. There is no world item placement at that spot in the game's data. The pebble simply exists, and nobody has produced a reproducible explanation for where it comes from. NPC behaviour anomalies extend to the doll herself, and the doll is worth extended discussion because the anomalies surrounding her are some of the most layered in the game. There is a specific interaction that occurs if you kill the doll, receive the special item she drops, wait a number of in-game cycles, and then return to the dream. The doll will have respawned, as expected, but if you position yourself in the corner of the gazebo to the left of the central path and watch the doll's ambient idle animation for an extended period without interacting with her, approximately 12 to 15 minutes of uninterrupted observation, her idle animation will briefly shift. For a period of 1 to 3 seconds, she enters an animation state that does not appear in her normal rotation. Players who have frame analysed this describe it as a forward-leaning posture, with the hands slightly raised, resembling either a supplication gesture or a reaching gesture depending on interpretation. The animation then ends, and she returns to her standard idle. This has been replicated enough times to rule out hardware variants. What it means, if it means anything, is unresolved. The doll anomaly deepens when you consider the audio that accompanies it. During the brief non-standard animation, the game plays no unique audio, but the ambient audio of the hunter's dream, which normally consists of soft environmental tones and distant wind, cuts out for the duration of the animation. Complete silence for 1 to 3 seconds in the hunter's dream. The dream's ambient audio has no other documented instance of cutting out under any conditions. It runs continuously from the moment the area loads to the moment it unloads. Whatever that animation is triggering, it is triggering something deep enough in the audio system to silence the entire ambient layer, not just the doll's personal audio channel. The ROM boss fight hosts an anomaly that feeds directly into debates about what ROM actually is and what role it serves in the game's cosmology. During the ROM encounter, there is a transition phase where the camera is briefly seized by a cutscene that pulls the sky open and reveals the amygdalae, the massive cosmic entities that were hidden in plain sight throughout Yharnam. This moment is designed to be revelatory. You see what was always there, but there is a documented frame during this sequence, captured through frame-by-frame analysis, where a different entity briefly appears in the sky. For approximately 4 frames, at standard frame rate, a silhouette occupies a position in the revealed sky that does not correspond to any of the amygdalae. It is present and then gone. Its shape, based on the frames captured, is inconsistent with the amygdalae's design. Players have proposed that it is a rendering artifact, a shadow from a geometry element accidentally passing through the scene during the transition. Others have proposed it is an intentional inclusion of a detail too brief for normal viewing, a glimpse of something else that inhabits the sky beyond the amygdala. Returning to environmental anomalies, the cathedral ward has one that is tied directly to one of the game's sadder NPC stories. The window of Ariana's apartment, the sex worker who offers you blood and can be directed to the safe location of Uden Chapel, is backlit with warm light at all times during the day cycle. At night, the light is slightly cooler. This is consistent with most interiors in the game, but there is a specific point in the main questline, after the blood moon has risen but before the player has triggered certain late-game events, where Ariana's window shows a different light entirely. Instead of warm or cool interior light, the window projects a deep red glow. This is not the blood moon's colour. The blood moon produces a reddish atmospheric effect on the exterior of buildings, but interior light sources are supposed to be shielded from that effect. The red from Ariana's window is coming from inside. The blood moon itself is the source of several anomalies that complicate the game's stated timeline. The blood moon rises as a consequence of specific player actions, replacing the night sky and transforming Yharnam in ways that have been extensively documented. What is less documented is the specific transition frame rate at which the blood moon rises. This matters because the rise is not instantaneous. It occurs over a short cutscene. But if you manipulate the game's loading state during this cutscene through a specific sequence of inputs that interrupt the cutscene's final frame, the blood moon state does not fully resolve. What you are left with is a hybrid sky state where the blood moon occupies approximately half of the sky's radius and the standard night sky occupies the rest. In this hybrid state, enemy spawns and placements reflect the blood moon configuration in some areas and the pre-blood moon configuration in others. This produces encounters that are not possible under normal play conditions, as enemies that only appear post-blood moon share the same physical space as enemies that despawn when the blood moon rises. One of the most frequently cited anomalies by the competitive and speedrunning community involves the game's handling of poison and the specific enemies in the Forbidden Woods who inflict it. The snakes, particularly the large snake clusters, have a poison application rate that is technically documented in the game's data. But there is a subset of snake enemies, visually indistinguishable from their standard counterparts, that have a poison application modifier 3 times higher than the documented value. These enemies were identified through statistical analysis of timed poison build-up rates, not through data mining, which means they were found by players noticing something was wrong before the code was checked. When the data was checked, the anomalous enemies existed as separate entity definitions with no clear reason for the discrepancy. They occupy the same spawn positions as standard snakes. They share the same model. The only difference is internal. Why they exist is unknown. One proposal is that they are remnants of an earlier, more punishing version of the poison system that was reduced before release, but not fully unified. Another is that they represent a specific subset of the snake population with a distinct identity in the fiction that the game never surfaces explicitly. The nightmare of Mensis is ground zero for anomalies of a different kind, ones that seem to deliberately disorient the player's understanding of the space's geography. The nightmare is presented as a distorted reflection of Yharnam, but the specific distortions are non-random. The placement of certain architectural elements suggests a logic to the transformation that is never explained. One of the clearest examples is the hanging cage structure that holds Murgo's wet nurse. In Yharnam, the corresponding space is an open courtyard. In the nightmare, that space becomes enclosed. The enclosure is not just visual. The game's navigation mesh treats the nightmare space as a closed interior, which affects how enemies path around the player and how audio propagates. Something about the nightmare transformed a courtyard into a room, and the game's systems know it. The amygdalae are central to several anomalies that touch on the game's hidden geometries. There is a well-known mechanic where the amygdalae that are normally invisible in Yharnam become visible to the player after certain progression thresholds related to insight. What is less discussed is the behavior of these entities once visible. Standard amygdalae, the ones you can interact with for fast travel, are relatively static. They sway. They occasionally shift their limbs. But there is one amygdala in Cathedral Ward, positioned on a rooftop that most players never look up at for long, that has an animation cycle that does not match the others. Its limb movements are faster, more irregular, and if you watch it for an extended period, it appears to track the player's position. Not in an obvious, horror game way. Subtly, the cluster of eyes in its central mass slowly rotates to maintain approximate orientation toward wherever your hunter is standing. Standard amygdalae do not do this. The lake in the nightmare of Menses, visible from the upper portions of the nightmare, but never accessible, is the subject of one of the most persistent environmental anomalies in the game. The lake is a background element, you can see it but never reach it, but under specific conditions involving the combination of certain chalice dungeon items, in the inventory, the lake's water surface reflection becomes active rather than static. Standard background water in Bloodborne uses pre-baked reflection maps, meaning the reflection doesn't respond to the game's dynamic lighting. When the reflection becomes active, it begins responding to the nightmare's red lighting in real time. And in doing so, it reflects the wrong sky. The nightmare of Mensis is under a specific, fixed sky. The active reflection on the lake shows something different, a sky that does not correspond to any zone in the game. Equipment behavior contributes its own set of anomalies, and one of the most interesting involves the hunter's weapons and their fire damage application in the presence of specific NPC enemies. There are certain enemies in the game that are supposed to be heavily resistant to fire, and the damage values confirm this resistance, but there are documented cases, again identified through statistical analysis before data mining confirmed them, where specific enemies that should resist fire instead receive full or amplified damage from fire sources. These enemies appear in fixed locations, are visually identical to their resistant counterparts, and exist in the game's data as separate entity entries, with the resistance value manually changed. Not a default value, manually set to something different. Someone decided these specific enemies in these specific locations should take more fire damage than the rest of their kind, and then never explained why. Ending this chapter where it begins, with the sense that Bloodborne's glitches and its lore are harder to separate than they first appear. When a game is built around the idea that the line between the real and the dreamed is permeable, when its architecture is literally described in the lore as shifting and unstable, when its NPCs are caught in loops, they cannot escape, and its enemies are defined by madness and transformation, the expected behavior of a bug changes. What reads as a physics engine failure in another game reads differently here. The twitching corpse, the doll's hidden animation, the pool reflecting a dawn that doesn't exist. These things could all be technical errors. They probably are, most of them. But the game they occur in is one that deliberately makes you distrust your own perception. And that distrust, once installed, does not turn off just because you step outside the fiction. Chapter 2. Unused content that almost changed everything. Every major game has cut content. Ideas that didn't survive development, mechanics that were abandoned, characters who were written and built, and then quietly removed before launch. Bloodborne is not unusual in having these things. What is unusual is how much of the cut content in Bloodborne feels like it belonged there, like it was load-bearing material that was removed, and the space it occupied was simply left hollow rather than filled in. The game's released state contains seams where removed content once sat, and those seams tell their own story about what Bloodborne was going to be. Start with the unused NPC dialogue. When the game's data is examined, there are audio files containing voice recordings that were cut before release. Some of these are simple variant lines for existing characters, alternative versions of dialogue that was rewritten, but several are recordings for interactions that have no corresponding triggers in the released game. There is a line for Gehrman, the first hunter, that is clearly intended for a moment after a specific revelation, a moment where Gehrman speaks directly about the hunter's dream's nature, in terms that are significantly more explicit than anything he says in the final game. The line exists, the moment it was written for does not. What this suggests is that at some point in development, the game contained a scene or progression point that brought Gehrman and the player into a more direct confrontational conversation about the dream's true nature. Whatever that scene was, it was removed. The explanation it contained was removed with it. There is a connected unused line from Patches, which is remarkable because Patches was cut from the base game entirely. The trickster merchant character, who appears in the Dark Souls series, was initially part of Bloodborne's cast. His presence is known through data in the game files. What makes the unused Patches content interesting in this context is that one of his retained audio files contains a reference to a specific location, a place called the Hall of Phagments, which appears nowhere in the released game's geography, dialogue, or item descriptions. The Hall of Phagments is mentioned as a location Patches visited before the events of the game, and he describes it as somewhere the good church folk wouldn't speak of. If Patches existed in the released game and referenced this place, it would presumably be a location the player could either visit or investigate. Without Patches, the Hall of Phagments exists as a name without a place, a location that was developed enough to warrant a specific reference, but was either cut with its associated content or was always meant to be implied rather than visited. The cut content around the Cainhurst Vilebloods is particularly dense. Cainhurst Castle, as released, is one of the more self-contained areas in the game. You go there, you find the castle's history, you encounter Queen Annalise, and the quest line with Alfred resolves around her fate. But data from the development files suggests that Cainhurst was once a significantly larger area, with at least one additional wing that was cut. The textures and geometry fragments for this wing suggest an interior section of the castle with a distinct visual identity, one focused on a library or archive space that the released castle doesn't contain. Within the data for this cut wing, there are item definition entries for objects that were never placed anywhere in the released game, including something labelled internally as Cainhurst Correspondence, a bundle of documents that appears to have been an item with lore text attached. The lore text was removed. The item ID exists. The documents it would have contained are gone. The Cainhurst cut content deepens in a way that changes the Vileblood questline if you assume it was intended to be in the game. Among the data fragments, there are enemy entity definitions for a type of Vileblood that doesn't appear in the released castle. The entity is physically distinct from the standard Vileblood nobles you encounter in Cainhurst. It is significantly larger, more armoured, and its animation set includes unique gestures that the standard Vilebloods don't have. It also has a faction tag that doesn't appear anywhere in the released game. The tag reads as something approximating Old Blood in the internal naming, separate from both the Hunter factions and the Vileblood faction as depicted in the release. Whatever this larger, armoured Vileblood entity was, it represented a subset of the Vileblood population with a distinct identity and presumably a distinct role in whatever the expanded Cainhurst content was meant to do. The presence of cut bosses in Bloodborne is well known in the community, but the specific implications of those cuts are worth examining more carefully. The most discussed cut boss is typically called the Abhorrent Beast in community shorthand, not the one that appears in the Old Hunters DLC, but an earlier, distinct entity that shares some visual DNA with the Beast clergyman encounters while being substantially different in design and scale. Data for this entity includes a boss Foggate trigger, an arena, and an unused soundtrack track. The track is particularly interesting because it is fully composed and produced. It is not a work-in-progress piece of music. It is a finished product, ready for implementation. The decision to cut this boss was made late enough in development that the music was already done. What that fight would have been and what narrative purpose it served is speculative, but the music's tone and structure, dark, chaotic, with prominent choral elements that echo the themes of the Healing Church music, suggests it was positioned somewhere in the game's arc that involved the church directly. The cut content around the Healing Church itself is voluminous, and separating what was intended to be in the game from what was early development experimentation is difficult. But there is one piece of cut church content that stands out because of how close it came to the surface. There are loading screen tips in the game's data that were not included in the final release cycle, and several of these tips reference mechanics, items, and locations that don't exist in the released game. One of these tips describes an item called the Church Barrier, described as a tool used by church physicians to slow the approach of a beast while the physician retreated to a safe position. No such item exists in the released game. The tip describes a mechanic in enough detail to suggest it was once a real item with real functionality, not a concept document entry. The specific language of the tip, physician rather than hunter, is also worth noting. It suggests a context where the player, or a relevant NPC, was in a role distinct from a hunter, a medical context within the church hierarchy. There is a category of cut content that is harder to trace because it lives in the texture data rather than entity or audio data. Across the environmental art of Bloodborne, there are surfaces that contain textures with detail that exceeds what the player would ever be able to see at standard viewing distances. High-resolution textures on background elements, walls deep in corridors, undersides of structures. This is not unusual in game development. Artists sometimes work at higher resolutions than the final asset requires, but in Bloodborne, several of these unusually detailed background textures contain text. Not lorem ipsum placeholder text, not repeated patterns. Legible text in a script that matches the game's internal world-building language. Most of this text is too distorted or too distant in the shipped game to be read. But there are two instances where the text has been resolved through both in-engine zoom manipulation and texture extraction, and what it says in both cases is a fragment of what appears to be a longer document. One fragment discusses blood ratios and purification cycles in language that matches the medical clinical voice of the game's item descriptions. The other fragment contains what appears to be a proper name that does not appear anywhere else in the game's released content. The cut content surrounding the doll takes on a specific weight given everything else we know about her. There are animation files in the game's data that are attached to the doll model but are never triggered in the released game. Several of these are standard utility animations, locomotion cycles, transition states, but there is one animation that serves no standard utility purpose. It is a long animation, nearly 30 seconds, in which the doll performs what can only be described as a ritual. The motion is deliberate, the gesture sequence is internally coherent in a way that random technical debris wouldn't be, and it ends in a held final position. This animation has no trigger conditions in the released game. It was built, fully, and then disconnected from any event that would play it. What ritual it depicts, what it was meant to accompany, and why it was removed from the game's interactive layer while remaining in the data is entirely unclear. The Chalice dungeons, as procedurally generated spaces, are a significant repository of cut content, because the systems used to generate them preserve information about content that was cut from the dungeon pool before release. There are tile sets in the dungeon data that are flagged as inactive, meaning the generation system knows they exist but will never select them. Among these inactive tile sets is one that stands out dramatically from the dungeon's visual language. The standard Chalice dungeon aesthetic is underground, stone-carved, ancient. This inactive tile set depicts an interior that looks like a room in a Yharnam building. Stone walls, yes, but with wooden furniture, a fireplace, a window that opens onto a void. It looks like someone's home was added to the Chalice dungeon tile pool and then removed. The furniture models in this tile set are not unique. They appear in the surface game, in Yharnam's buildings. They were taken from the surface and placed underground in a Chalice dungeon, and then that placement was switched off. The final and perhaps most consequential cut content is tied directly to the ending of the game. Bloodborne has 3 endings in its released state, but data analysis has found evidence of at least one more ending that was cut. The evidence is circumstantial but consistent. There are dialogue files that don't belong to any of the 3 endings, an animation state for the game's final area that is not triggered by any of the 3 ending conditions, and a unique piece of music that plays at no point in the released game, but whose metadata tags it as an ending sequence. The cut ending's music is significantly quieter and less resolved than the music for the 3 released endings. It lacks the cathartic quality, positive or negative, that the released endings all have in different ways. It sounds like something that simply continues. Not a resolution, not a transformation, just a continuation into something unnamed. Whatever that ending involved, the choice to cut it in favour of the 3 definitive resolutions changes the texture of the game's thematic statement. The released game forces a choice. The cut ending suggests there was once a 4th option, the option to remain exactly where and what you are. Chapter 3. The blood echoes that don't belong. Blood echoes are the currency of survival in Bloodborne. They are the accumulation of everything the hunter has taken from the dead, held temporarily in the body, lost on death, and waiting to be recovered at the site of failure. The metaphor is clean and well understood. You are literally carrying the deaths of everything you've killed, and losing that makes you lighter, easier to kill again. But there are blood echoes in Bloodborne that don't fit this framework. Echoes that appear without a source. Echoes tied to events that have no enemy, no kill, no standard explanation for where they came from. The most basic category of anomalous blood echoes involves the small amounts that occasionally appear in locations where no enemy has been killed and no item grants echoes on pickup. These are typically in the range of 1 to 5 echoes, amounts so small they're easy to miss. But if you enter an area at the right moment, before the game has finished loading its enemy population, and you collect the echoes that are present before those enemies spawn, you sometimes find echoes that exceed the total any enemy in that area would provide. Not dramatically, not thousands of extra echoes, just slightly more than should be there. This was initially attributed to floating point errors in the echo accounting system, a technical explanation that made sense. But the anomaly is consistent across platforms, including ones where floating point behavior differs, which complicates the rounding error explanation. There is a specific location in the unseen village at night, after the blood moon has risen, where a cluster of blood echoes appears with no dead enemy nearby and no recent kill that could have left them. The amount is specific. 735 echoes. This is not a random echo count. 735 is a value that appears in the game's item data as the echo value of a specific Carol rune. The rune is the claw mark. The claw mark rune is connected to the Great One Amygdala, or so the community has proposed, based on the rune's item description, referencing an imprinting associated with a claw-like mark on a corpse. Finding 735 echoes, the exact echo value of the claw mark rune, sitting unattended in Yharnam after the blood moon rises, has no clean explanation. It could be a coincidence of numbers. It probably is. But the location, the amount, and the timing align in a way that makes the coincidence uncomfortable. The echo economy of the hunter's dream is generally treated as zero-sum. You bring echoes in, you spend echoes, you return to the surface with whatever you have left. But there is a documented phenomenon where, on returning to the hunter's dream, from certain areas, the player receives a small echo amount without any recent kill to source it from. This phantom echo delivery has been traced in some cases to the dream's merchant the messengers, and their animation state at the moment of the player's arrival. Specifically, if the messengers are in a particular rare idle animation, one where they appear to be exchanging something among themselves, and the player arrives from a specific set of source areas during this animation, the phantom echo delivery is more likely. This could be an animation timing coincidence, triggering a misfire in the echo accounting system. It could also be that the messenger exchange animation is tied to a system that generates a small echo deposit for reasons that are not surfaced to the player. Blood echoes have a relationship to memory in the game's fiction. When you carry echoes and die, the echoes go to the place where you died, waiting for recovery. The implication is that echoes persist in a location even when you're not there. They wait. This is confirmed mechanically every time you recover your echoes from a previous death site. But there is a less examined implication. If echoes wait at death sites, and you can only carry echoes that came from kills you committed, then a death site with more echoes than you had when you died represents an impossibility. There are documented cases of exactly this, arriving at a death site and finding more echoes than you had at the time of death. Not dramatically more. The excess ranges from under 100 to several hundred echoes over what the death recording indicates. Where the extra echoes come from has no mechanical explanation. The most dramatic echo anomaly in the game involves a player action that should result in 0 echoes, dying in the hunter's dream. The dream is a safe zone. You cannot be killed there under standard conditions, but there is a very specific method of forcing the game to register a player death in the dream, involving a specific sequence of transitions between the dream and a loaded area that produces a death state in the dream zone rather than the connected area. When this occurs, the game produces a death screen and respawns the player in the dream itself. The echo total carried at the moment of this death should appear at the death site in the dream, but the dream does not have a death site system. There is nowhere for the echoes to go. What actually happens is that the echoes are silently added to a hidden reserve in the dream's memory state, and they can be recovered not by reaching a visible death site, but by speaking to the doll. Not through her standard echo exchange function, just through speaking to her. One of her standard conversational lines delivers the echo recovery as a standard pickup event. Why the dream's death system routes orphaned echoes through the doll's dialogue. Event is a question without a clear technical answer, though the narrative reading of it is almost too clean. The doll is holding on to something that was lost. Chapter 4. The Nightmare's Architecture. The Nightmare of Mensis is described in the game's lore as a nightmare that was made, not found. The Mensis scholars performed a ritual that contacted a Great One and got dragged into a nightmare as a consequence, most of them losing their minds in the process. The survivors are imprisoned in cages to suppress the mental rot that the connection to the Great One caused. This is the stated explanation for the nightmare's existence. But the architecture of the nightmare tells a more complicated story, one that doesn't fully align with the idea of a space that was accidentally created through a ritual gone wrong. The first thing to note about the Nightmare of Mensis is its scope. It is not a small space. It contains an exterior environment, multiple interior structures, a labyrinthine dungeon below, and a distinct area at its peak that serves as the arena for the game's penultimate boss. For a nightmare that was supposedly created as an unintended side effect of a ritual, the scale is remarkable. Nightmares in the game's fiction are not boundless. They are spaces with boundaries, however strange those boundaries are. The Nightmare of Mensis's boundaries suggest it was not hastily constructed by an accidental summons. The space is too internally consistent, too purposefully arranged. It suggests either that nightmares are shaped by the expectations of the minds that inhabit them, building themselves into coherent spaces from the scaffolding of memory and belief, or that the Mensis ritual was not as accidental as the lore implies. The specific architectural element that most challenges the accidental creation reading is the presence of the iron gates throughout the nightmare. Gates in game environments are typically ornamental or functional, controlling player access and creating rhythm in exploration. But the gates in the Nightmare of Mensis are interesting because of where they are positioned relative to the nightmare's stated function. The Mensis scholars are victims. They created a ritual that went wrong and were punished for it. If the nightmare is a space shaped by their mental state, a prison of their own construction, the gates should logically be oriented to keep them in, to prevent escape. Some of the gates are, but several of the nightmare's gates are oriented to prevent entry into certain areas from outside, not exit from inside. Something in the nightmare's architecture was designed at the level of physical space to keep something out rather than in. The nightmare's geography contains an anomaly that feeds directly into questions about its relationship to the surface world. The positioning of the nightmare's architectural elements, when mapped and compared to Yharnam's layout, reveals correspondences that are too specific to be coincidental. The nightmare is understood as a distorted reflection of Yharnam, but the distortion is not uniform. Certain elements of Yharnam are faithfully reproduced in the nightmare, in the same relative positions. Others are wildly displaced or absent entirely. The pattern of faithful reproduction versus displacement is not random. The elements that are faithfully reproduced are the elements associated with the Mensis scholar's ritual: the altar, the cage structures, the approach paths. The elements associated with ordinary Yharnam life, the civilian architecture, the mundane streets, are the displaced or absent ones. The nightmare kept what the ritual knew, and lost what it didn't need. The ceiling of the nightmare's exterior space is worth close examination. Most of Bloodborne's exterior environments have functional skies, meaning the sky is a rendered element that changes with the time cycle and responds to the game's atmospheric systems. The Nightmare of Mensis' sky does not change. It is fixed in a permanent red twilight. But the ceiling geometry of the nightmare, the architectural limit of the space, is lower than the ceiling of any other exterior zone in the game. In most exterior zones, the sky continues effectively, indefinitely, above the player. In the nightmare, the sky has a ceiling, a hard geometric limit above which the space ends. This is technically necessary because the nightmare is a closed simulation within the game's architecture, a space that has to have hard edges because it can't pretend to be infinite. But the closedness of the nightmare sky has a narrative resonance that the game never directly articulates. You can look up in the nightmare and see, even if you can't consciously clock it, that the sky stops, that there is a lid on this space, the central structure of the nightmare. The building complex that contains the path through to Murgo is organised around a vertical axis in a way that is unusual for Bloodborne's architecture. Most of the game's buildings are navigated laterally, with vertical progression being secondary. The nightmare's central structure reverses this. Progress through it is fundamentally downward, into the dungeon below, and then upward again to the peak. The structure is organised around a descent and ascent, and the nature of what you encounter at the lowest point, the living failures and the brain of Mensis, is distinct from what you encounter at the highest, Murgo's wet nurse. The descent takes you to failure. The ascent takes you to grief. The architecture is encoding a specific emotional and narrative journey. You go down to see what the ritual produced at its worst, and you go up to confront what it was reaching for. The brain of Mensis is the most anomalous architectural element in the nightmare, and possibly in the entire game. It is not a boss. It is not an enemy in the standard sense. It is a massive, veined, pulsating mass of neural tissue that hangs in an open space within the dungeon, visible through a grated window from a distance before you encounter it directly. Its scale is staggering. It is larger than any boss in the game. It does not move in a conventional way. It radiates a status effect, the frenzy build-up. just by being perceived. And crucially, it has a specific role in the mensis ritual. It is maintaining the contact with the nightmare, serving as a living antenna pointed at whatever great one the ritual reached. The brain is the reason the nightmare persists. Remove the brain as the game allows you to via a switch mechanism, and a large portion of the nightmare's enemy ecology is disrupted. The brain's removal doesn't end the nightmare, it keeps going. The nightmare was made, and making it was enough. The thing that made it can be turned off, and the nightmare continues regardless. Chapter 5. What the item descriptions don't tell you. Bloodborne's lore is delivered primarily through item descriptions, and those descriptions are masterworks of implication. They tell you things slant, they give you the corner of a picture, and let your mind fill in the rest. The community has spent years filling in those corners, and the consensus interpretations are well known. The Byrgenwerth connection, the nature of the Great Ones, the truth behind the blood ministration. But there is a secondary layer in the item descriptions that receives less attention. The things the descriptions conspicuously don't tell you. The gaps, the omissions, the moments where a description ends one sentence before the sentence that would actually explain something. The Cainhurst summons is one of the clearest examples. It is an item that allows access to Cainhurst Castle, and its description explains exactly what it is and who sent it. It was sent by Anomalies, Queen of the Vilebloods, to invite a hunter to come and be knighted. The description tells you the who and the what. It does not tell you how Anomalies knew to send the summons. The player character arrives in Yharnam as a stranger. The network of events that led to their existence being known to a reclusive queen in an isolated castle accessed only by a horse-drawn carriage is never explained. The summons exists, it was sent. The mechanism by which a queen in a castle that requires specific transport to access learned about you and decided to invite you specifically is absent from the description. The description ends before explaining the thing that would actually be interesting to know. The Sword Hunter badge, obtained from a specific enemy in the Cathedral Ward, tells you about the Healing Church's hierarchy of hunters and the division between the hunter class that uses beast hunting tools and the hunter class that protects the church's internal interests. What the description leaves out is the nature of the protection. The church's internal interests, whatever those are, were significant enough to warrant a dedicated protective force with their own badge and their own distinct equipment. The description tells you the force existed. It does not tell you what they were protecting the church from, or whether that threat was external or internal. The distinction matters enormously for understanding the church's political situation before the events of the game. A protective force defending against external threats implies a church under siege from outside. A protective force defending against internal threats implies a church with significant internal conflict. The item description is precisely silent on this point. The old hunter bone, an item whose description discusses a hunter who moved so quickly that others believed him to use a form of forbidden blood tinge, contains a phrase that has generated significant community discussion. The old hunters were said to have had the strength of the church behind them. This is generally interpreted as a statement about institutional support. The church backs the old hunters, but the specific phrasing is worth examining. It says the strength of the church rather than the support of the church. Strength implies something physical, something transferred rather than just granted. And the context is a description about movement speed, about a hunter whose physical capabilities were so enhanced that they seemed supernatural to observers. The sentence, read carefully, suggests that what the church provided to the old hunters was not just resources or legitimacy, but something that physically enhanced them. The description stops exactly there. It does not say what that strength was or how it was transmitted. The Iosefka's blood vial item, the blood vials provided by the NPC Iosefka from behind her clinic door, is a perfect example of an item description that encodes more than it surfaces. The description notes that the blood is of superior quality, consistent in its properties, suggesting careful preparation. The implication is that Iosefka is a skilled physician, producing a better product than the standard blood that circulates through Yharnam. What the description doesn't tell you, and what is implied by the game's progression, but never explicitly stated in the description itself, is that the blood's superior quality may be tied to its source in a way the player might not want to examine too closely. The description is complimentary about Iosefka's product, at a point in the game where you have no reason to be suspicious of it. The description never changes. It remains complimentary regardless of what you learn about Iosefka and her research. The description is a lie of omission preserved in amber. The Great Lake Rune, a Carol rune that increases physical defense, contains a description that is almost entirely factual and mechanical. It tells you it is a rune. It tells you what it does. It tells you that Carol runes are the transcription of Great One voices into a humanly legible form. The description is among the more clinical in the game. But the name is the anomaly, the Great Lake. There is no Great Lake in Bloodborne's geography. There is the lake in the nightmare of Mensis, visible but unreachable. There is no surface lake of note. The rune is named for something that doesn't exist in any accessible part of the world. The description does not explain the name. Community interpretations range from the Great Lake being a metaphor, a rune that invokes the stillness and depth of water as a conceptual anchor for physical fortitude, to the Great Lake being a real place that simply doesn't appear in the game's explorable areas, a location in Yharnam's broader geography that was cut, or a location in the nightmare geography that cannot be reached. The choir set of armor items belonging to the elite branch of the Healing Church contains descriptions that are individually interesting, but become significantly more interesting when read together. Each piece describes a different aspect of the choir's function and beliefs. The chest piece mentions the choir's access to the upper reaches of the Healing Church, a physical elevation that corresponds to the orphanage. The headpiece describes the choir as having witnessed the truth of the sky. The gloves describe hands that have touched the heavens. The boots describe a path walked into light that burns. Read as a sequence. The choir's armor describes a journey upward, from the church's foundational levels through to a sky-level truth. And the final item in the sequence describes that truth as something that burns. The journey up produces damage. Whatever the choir found at the upper reaches of their elevation, the truth of the sky they witnessed hurt them. The individual descriptions are careful. The sequence they form is not careful at all. The Canehurst armor set descriptions, belonging to the Vile Blood faction's aesthetics, contain a recurring detail that has not been fully resolved. References to the old blood of the line. The Vile Bloods are associated with a specific quality of blood that is tainted in a way the Healing Church condemns. But the descriptions don't describe the blood as tainted. They describe it as old, the oldest blood. The implication is that the Vile blood predates the Healing Church's blood ministration, that the Vile bloodline carries a lineage of blood that existed before the Church's program began. This would mean the Vile bloods are not a corruption of the Church's system. They predate it. The Church declared them corrupt because the Church built its entire identity around a blood program, and a group carrying older, unauthorized blood represents a challenge to the Church's central claim of being the origin and custodian of the blood's power. The descriptions of the Sinister Bell items, the tools used in Bloodborne's cooperative and competitive multiplayer systems, contain a specific phrase that has been discussed extensively but never resolved. They are described as resonating with the nightmare. Not connecting to other players, not functioning as communication devices, but resonating with the nightmare itself. The nightmare in the game's lore is not a neutral space, It is a place of imprisonment and madness, the consequence of contact with the Great Ones gone wrong. The multiplayer bell items work by, according to their descriptions, tuning into that resonance. The implication is that every multiplayer connection in Bloodborne, every cooperative summon, and every competitive invasion is occurring through the nightmare. The gameplay layer presents this as a fun mechanic. The description layer presents it as two hunters using a dimension of suffering as a telephone. Chapter 6. The Great Ones and what they actually want. The Great Ones are the cosmic entities at the centre of Bloodborne's fiction, and the game's relationship with them is deliberately ambiguous. They are worshipped by factions in the game world, feared by others, and approached with desperate hope by those who believe contact with them represents the next stage of human evolution. The game never definitively tells you what the Great Ones want. It shows you the consequences of human attempts to contact them, reach them, and understand them. Those consequences are almost uniformly terrible. But the specific nature of the terrible consequences and the way different Great Ones produce different kinds of terrible suggests that what the Great Ones want, if want is even the right word, is not uniform across the group. Ebrietas, the Great One found at the end of the orphanage, is one of the more legible members of the Great Ones in terms of motivation, and what her behaviour suggests is strange. She is described as a Great One who was left behind. The other Great Ones departed or moved beyond or changed in ways that left Ebrietas where she was while the others moved forward. The Healing Church found her and built the orphanage to study her. Ebrietas stayed, and when you fight her, she does something unique among the game's bosses. She bows her head. At the beginning of the encounter, after the cutscene triggers, there is a brief moment before she attacks where she appears to be in a posture of supplication. She is bowing to the hunter, an entity that could potentially destroy you, that the Healing Church built an entire institution around studying, bows to you before the fight begins. One reading is that Ebrietas is not hostile, that the attack that follows is defensive rather than aggressive, that she is acknowledging something about the hunter's status before defending herself. Another reading is that the bow is grief, that Ebrietas has been doing this for centuries and is simply, quietly exhausted. The Moon Presence, the Great One encountered at the game's first ending, is the entity most directly responsible for the hunter's dream. The dream is described as the Moon Presence's realm, a space created and maintained to serve its purposes. And its purposes, as the game reveals through the first ending, involve trapping hunters in an eternal cycle, binding their consciousness to the dream and perpetuating the hunt indefinitely. The Moon Presence needs hunters. It does not need them to succeed. It needs them to hunt. The cycle perpetuates regardless of outcome. What this suggests about what the Moon Presence wants is a specific kind of want. Not conquest, not worship. Not the simple violence that some cosmic horror narratives reduce their entities to, but maintenance. The Moon Presence wants the cycle to continue because the cycle itself is the point. The hunting is the thing. What it produces, what is being accumulated through all those cycles of death and dreaming, is never explicitly named. Murgo, the infant Great One encountered in the Nightmare of Mensis, is perhaps the most heartbreaking anomaly in the game's cosmic roster. Murgo is a child, a wailing child, an entity that makes the sound of an infant in distress as its primary sensory characteristic. You cannot see Murgo. You never see Murgo. You fight Murgo's wet nurse, the guardian entity, and when that fight ends, the crying stops. The implication is that Murgo is dead, or has moved on, or has been released from something. The nightmare begins to end. Murgo's nature as a Great One means its distress has consequences for the humans caught in its nightmare, but the entity itself is simply a crying child. Whatever cosmic significance attaches to Murgo, whatever role it plays in the Great One's broader existence, its primary characteristic throughout the nightmare is suffering. The Great One trapped at the heart of the nightmare of Mensis is not malevolent, it is an infant in pain. The amygdalae are the most numerous Great Ones in the game's world, present throughout Yharnam in numbers that dwarf any other named Great One. They are hidden, perceivable, only by those with sufficient insight. Their function, as far as the game reveals, is twofold. They provide access to the hunter's dream through the lantern mechanic, and they occasionally tear hunters into the nightmare against their will. The combination of these two functions is worth examining. The same entities that provide safe fast travel also forcibly abduct hunters and deposit them in a prison dimension. This is either a contradiction, or the amygdalae's function is more unified than it appears. One possible reading is that the amygdala are managing traffic between the surface world and the various nightmare and dream spaces, and the distinction between willing fast travel and forced abduction is a distinction that doesn't register for them. Transportation is transportation. The consent of the transported is irrelevant to the function. Formless Odin, the Great One, who has no physical form, is present in the game not as a visible entity, but as an implication scattered across item descriptions and architectural details. The Uden Chapel in Yharnam is dedicated to Uden. The Uden Writhe and Uden Coldblood runes are named for Uden. The lore associated with Uden circles around the idea that Uden, alone among the Great Ones, has no physical manifestation. Uden exists only in the blood, and in the voices, and in the echoes of the things it has touched. The implications of a Great One that is formless are significant. The Healing Church's entire apparatus around blood could be understood as an apparatus built around Uden, without the Church fully understanding that this is what they are building. A religion centered on blood, in a world where the formless Great One lives in blood, where every use of blood ministration is potentially an act of communion with something that neither side of the exchange fully comprehends. Chapter 7. The hunters who came before Bloodborne's present tense narrative, the night of the hunt that the player experiences, is the front face of a story that extends much further back. The hunters who came before the player's character, the founders of the hunting tradition, and the great figures of the old hunts, are known to us only through what they left behind. Their equipment, their notes, the mentions of their names in other people's stories, and what they left behind suggests that the history of hunting in Yharnam is not a story of progress and refinement. It is a story of something going progressively, catastrophically wrong over generations, with each major hunter figure in the lineage representing a step further into the abyss. Gehrman, the first hunter, is the most discussed of the old hunters, and his story is well known. He was the first. He created the workshop. He shaped the tradition. He became trapped in the hunter's dream, and has been there for an unknowable span of time. His emotional state, his relationship to the hunt, and to the entities he served, and his genuine wish for the player's freedom are among the most affecting elements in the game's narrative. But the specific question of what Gehrman was like before the dream is not fully answered. The few references to his pre-dream existence describe a capable hunter and a skilled craftsman. They do not describe a broken man. The breaking happened in the dream. Whatever the hunter's dream asked of Gehrman over its long history, it changed him from a capable founder into the wheelchair-bound figure the player encounters. The dream did this to him, and knowing what it did to Gehrman, who was the first and was presumably the most prepared for it, tells you something about what a long enough exposure to the moon presence's maintained reality does to a human mind. Maria, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, is the old hunter whose story the Old Hunters DLC centers on, and she is interesting specifically because of the point at which she stopped hunting. Maria was a great hunter, a student of Gehrman's, skilled and effective, and then she threw her weapons into a well and never hunted again. The item description of her weapon, the Rakuyo, describes this moment obliquely. The specific event that triggered Maria's retirement is connected to the fishing hamlet, and the fishing hamlet's lore suggests that something was done to the inhabitants of that coastal settlement that crossed a line even for Maria. The details are fragmented across several item descriptions and environmental details. But what emerges is a picture of a hunter who was fine with the violence of the hunt until the hunt's violence was directed at something that wasn't a beast, wasn't a monster, wasn't a target that could be justified as such. Maria's line was drawn by something the other hunters didn't draw a line at. She stopped. They continued. Simon the Harrowed, another old hunter encountered in the Old Hunters DLC, presents a different kind of hunter history. Simon was not a great fighter. He was not notable for his skill or his legacy in the way Gehrman or Maria were. He was a hunter who survived by being careful and thoughtful, and by carrying a bowgun at a significant distance from whatever he was hunting. Simon's history is the history of the ordinary hunter, the unremarkable one, and what happened to ordinary hunters in Yharnam's old hunts is a story the game tells through Simon's presence and his dialogue. The extraordinary hunters become legendary or become cautionary tales. The ordinary hunters mostly just don't survive. Simon surviving long enough to be encountered in the hunter's nightmare is itself a form of anomaly. He made it. He figured out something about the rules of the nightmare that most hunters never get the chance to learn, and his presence there as a functioning conversational entity while others have degraded into enemies says something about the role that self-awareness plays in the nightmare's corrosive effects on the mind. The powder kegs, the splinter faction of the old workshop that favoured improvised explosive and unconventional weapons, are known from their badges and their items and a few scattered NPC references. But the story of the powder kegs is essentially the story of a philosophical disagreement within hunting culture that was resolved not by debate, but by attrition. The powder kegs believed that any tool that served the hunt was legitimate. The main workshop had more conservative ideas about methodology. The powder kegs were marginalised and eventually disbanded, their philosophy surviving only in their techniques and in the weapons they left behind. What this story suggests about Yharnam's hunting culture is that there was, at some point, an active discourse about what the hunt should look like. People had opinions, factions formed, the powder kegs lost, and the weapons they invented, the ones that were considered too extreme or too unconventional, are some of the most effective tools in the game. The faction that was dismissed for being too much got the best toys. Whether that irony is intentional is unclear, but it's difficult to miss. Chapter 8. The City That Was Always Dying. Yharnam is a city in the middle of a catastrophe. That much is obvious from the first time you walk through the central Yharnam streets, past the burning bodies and the violent mobs and the beasts that were people yesterday. But there is a layer of Yharnam's history that precedes the current catastrophe, a period when Yharnam was dying in a slower, quieter way, and the evidence of that older dying is still present in the city's architecture and geography if you know what you're looking for. The Great Bridge of Central Yharnam, the elevated walkway connecting the main approach to the cathedral ward, offers a view of the city that most players move through quickly. But the buildings visible from the bridge tell a story that the street-level navigation doesn't. Many of Yharnam's buildings, particularly in the central areas, show signs of multiple renovation periods layered on top of each other. Original stone construction, visible in the lower sections of many buildings, has been built over with brick, then covered again with plaster, then modified again. The city has been updated multiple times. Yharnam has been changing, repairing, building over itself for a long time before the current catastrophe. The catastrophe didn't happen to a stable city. It happened to a city that was already constantly in the process of trying to fix something. The Forbidden Woods, geographically speaking, are where Yharnam puts the things it doesn't want to look at. The path to the Forbidden Woods is hidden. The area's approach requires navigating past the Healing Church's workshop and through spaces that are not intuitively accessible. The woods themselves contain a village, several buildings, evidence of an established community that was living outside Yharnam's walls and outside the Healing Church's direct authority. The village in the Forbidden Woods was conducting its own form of ritual, its own relationship with whatever strange presences inhabit those trees, independently of the main city's official programs. This community existed apparently for some time in parallel with Yharnam proper. The question of whether Yharnam knew about the Forbidden Woods community and looked away, or genuinely didn't know, has significant implications for the city's relationship to the weirdness on its periphery. The presence of the Thumerian ruins beneath Yharnam is the city's deepest layer of history, and the Chalice dungeons are the excavation of that history. The Thumerians predate Yharnam. They built things beneath the ground that the modern city is built on top of. The relationship between Yharnam's surface civilization and the Thumerian civilization below is not one of conquest or inheritance in the standard historical sense. It is stranger. The Healing Church is actively engaged with the ruins. Their rituals descend into them. The Chalice dungeons are not merely archaeological sites. They are active spaces where the Church is conducting ongoing operations. Yharnam was not built on ruins that it forgot about. Yharnam was built on ruins that it is still using, still descending into, still extracting something from. The city's foundation is not metaphorically alive. It is literally alive, and some portion of Yharnam's official activity is centered on managing what that foundation does. The final and most persistent anomaly about Yharnam as a city is the question of who is maintaining it. The catastrophe has clearly been going on for at minimum one full night cycle, and the evidence suggests it has been recurring across many nights. The blood ministration program has been producing beasts for an extended period. The Healing Church has been aware of the problem and managing it badly for longer than anyone in the city seems willing to acknowledge. And yet the city functions. The lamps light, the buildings stand. The narrow streets are swept clean in certain areas, passable and navigable. Someone is maintaining Yharnam under conditions that should make maintenance impossible. The city has caretakers who have not succumbed to the hunt, who continue their maintenance functions through the chaos. They are never seen directly. Their work is visible everywhere. The game ends where it ends. Whether in sacrifice, in transcendence, or in transformation, the night of the hunt comes to some kind of close. But Yharnam continues. The city was there before the player arrived. It will be there after whatever the player's ending implies. The walls will stand. The buildings will settle further into their Pthumerian foundations. Whatever was begun so long ago in the ruins beneath the city will continue, at whatever pace it has always moved. The anomalies that mark the game's surfaces, the twitching bodies and the wrong reflections, and the blood echoes with no source, are not bugs in a stable world. They are symptoms of a world that has never been stable. A city built on the wrong ground, in communion with the wrong things, for long enough that the wrong things have become structural. You cannot patch out what Yharnam is. You can only hunt through it. Chapter 9. The Messengers and What They Know. The Messengers are the strangest presence in Bloodborne that most players stop thinking about after the first few hours. They are small. They are everywhere. They hand you items from the floor with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm. They cluster around the storage box in the hunter's dream with the energy of people who have been waiting specifically for you and are extremely glad you showed up. They wear hats you find for them. They pose. They communicate something that reads, at first glance, as pure comic relief, as the game's way of softening the edges of an otherwise brutally grim world. And then you start reading item descriptions, and you realise that the messengers are something the game never explains, never fully addresses, and never allows you to question directly. The messenger item description is almost offensively vague. It tells you they are inhabitants of the dream, that they are known to be messengers, and that their nature is unclear even to those who have encountered them. This is the entire official account of what the messengers are. The game gives you more lore about random environmental objects in Yharnam streets than it gives you about the creatures that populate the hunter's dream and serve as your primary interface with that space, and that near total absence of explanation in a game that is generally very generous with explanation when it wants to be, is either an oversight or a deliberate choice. Given that Bloodborne very rarely makes oversights of that magnitude in its world building, the absence reads as deliberate. There is something about the messengers that the game has decided not to tell you. The question is what? The first strange thing about the messengers is their apparent happiness. Every other entity connected to the Great Ones is either damaged by that connection, desperate because of it, or in the process of losing their mind due to it. The Mensis scholars went mad. The doll has a fractured, melancholy quality, even in her kindness. Yharnam is broken by centuries of imprisonment in a space that was supposed to be a gift. The messengers are fine. They are, as far as any behavioral reading suggests, content. They live in the hunter's dream, a space maintained by one of the most powerful and manipulative entities in the game's cosmology, and they are cheerful about it. Either the messengers are immune to whatever the moon presence does to human minds, because the messengers are not human and never were, or the messengers are so far below the moon presence's threshold of interest that they simply don't register as something to affect. Or, and this is the reading that feels most uncomfortable, the messengers are happy because their purpose is being fulfilled, and their purpose is not something the player would be comfortable knowing about. The messengers deliver items. This is their primary function as far as the player understands it. You leave items in the storage box. The messengers make them available at item pickup points throughout the world, and the system works smoothly enough that you stop thinking about the mechanism. But when you think about the mechanism, it is genuinely strange. The messengers are moving items between the dream and Yharnam's physical reality. They are operating across the boundary between a constructed nightmare space and the material world. For small creatures that appear to be made of grey flesh and wear whatever decorative hat you give them, this represents an extraordinary capability. The doll cannot leave the dream. Yharnam cannot leave the dream. The messengers slip in and out of it constantly, depositing your equipment at locations across a city experiencing a violent catastrophe, and then return to wait for you with what appears to be excitement. Whatever the messengers are, their relationship to the boundary between the dream and the waking world is categorically different from every other entity connected to that space. There are messengers in the game's physical world as well, not just in the hunter's dream. They appear at specific locations in Yharnam, if you look for them, typically in corners and alcoves and places slightly off the main path. These physical world messengers don't offer you items or acknowledge you in the way the dream messengers do. They simply exist in the world, clustered in small groups, sometimes appearing to gesture at something nearby. Community members who have catalogued the locations of these physical world messengers have found that they consistently appear near points of significance, near doors that lead to important transitions, near corpses that carry notable items, near architectural details that encode something about an area's history. The messengers in the physical world are positioned as if they are pointing at things, whether they are guides who have always known where to stand or something stranger that has been attracted to these locations by the same quality that makes them significant is not answered. The hat cosmetics available for messengers expand into something interesting when examined as a complete set. The hats you can give to messengers include the caretaker's hat, the nightmarish mummer's cap, the pebble, the noble dress top, and several others. Each of these is associated with something specific in Yharnam's world. The caretaker's hat connects to the custodial presence in the city. The mummer's cap connects to performance and deception, the noble dress to the aristocratic history of Canehurst. These aren't random selections from the game's wardrobe. They are a miniature index of Yharnam's social categories, and dressing messengers in them produces something that reads, if you're looking for it, as a tiny stage play of Yharnam's class structure. Little grey creatures in the hats of the city's various factions, gathered in a dream that sits above all those factions. The reading may be over-applied, but the specific curation of the hat options makes it feel like whoever designed this system was aware of exactly this kind of reading. The most significant messenger anomaly is tied to the old hunter's bone, an item connected to a hunter whose movement was so uncanny that others believed it involved some prohibited form of blood art. The item, when examined in the game's memory, shows that it has a messenger interaction state that is not triggered in the released game. Specifically, there is an animation in the messenger behavior set that is conditionally triggered based on whether the player holds the old hunter's bone and stands near a specific messenger cluster in the hunter's dream for an extended period. The animation has the messengers shifting their posture, leaning away from the player in a gesture that reads as aversion or fear. The messengers are not designed to show fear. Their behavior set does not include fear responses to any other stimulus. Whatever about the old hunter's bone triggers that particular animation, and whatever about the entity this item belonged to would make the messengers react with aversion to its carrier is not explained. The animation exists. No condition in the released game plays it. The messenger's relationship to blood echoes is the final and most mechanically grounded anomaly in their behavior set. When the player stores blood echoes in the game's memory, those echoes are associated with a kill event or a death event. They have a source, but the small amounts of echoes that occasionally manifest near messenger clusters, the phantom echo deliveries mentioned in an earlier chapter, suggest that the messengers are capable of generating echo values without a corresponding kill or death event. If that is what is happening, it means the messengers are producing something that in the game's fiction is the distilled essence of violent death. The messengers are making death product. They are small and cheerful, and they hand you things from the floor, and they generate, apparently, a small and steady trickle of something that should only exist as a consequence of killing. Whether this makes them disturbing or merely inexplicable depends on how comfortable you are with the idea that the helpful little creatures in your safe space are continuously producing a byproduct of mortality. The game never tells you to be disturbed by this. The game never tells you anything about it at all. Chapter 10: Insight and What It Costs. Insight is the game's second currency, the one that measures not wealth or experience, but understanding. It accumulates when you witness things that exceed normal human perception. A boss fog gate crossed for the first time, a great one encountered, a nightmare entered. The game tracks your exposure to the beyond, and as that exposure grows, the game changes. Enemies behave differently at high insight levels. Certain visual elements that were absent become present. The world reveals details that were always there, but that a less experienced mind couldn't access. Insight is, mechanically, a measure of how much of the truth your character has absorbed. The cost of insight is something the game implies but never calculates for you explicitly. Gehrman's dialogue suggests that too much understanding of the Great One's world is damaging. The item descriptions for insight-granting consumables describe their effects in ways that involve rupture and expansion, language that is adjacent to violation. The insight economy, the way the game asks you to spend it at the messenger's bath to purchase items, treats insight as equivalent to conventional currency, which is a strange design choice if insight is supposed to represent cognitive damage from exposure to the cosmic. You are trading your sanity at a small shop for trinkets. This is either a darkly comic observation about how humans assign value, or a very specific statement about what happens to the things you understand once you've processed them. Understanding doesn't accumulate indefinitely, it converts into something purchasable, something expendable. The knowledge becomes tradable, and in becoming tradable, it becomes less than knowledge. High insight levels change enemy behavior in documented ways. Certain enemies gain additional attack patterns. Certain NPCs change their dialogue. The winter lanterns in the Nightmare of Mensis become even more dangerous. But there is a category of high insight behavioral changes that is less documented, involving enemies in the Cathedral Ward. Specifically, the Cathedral Ward's huntsmen, the human enemies that patrol the ward's plazas, have a behavior state that is only accessible at insight levels above 40 that is not listed in any official documentation. At these levels, there is a small but statistically consistent chance that a huntsman who would normally attack the player on sight instead pauses and does not aggress immediately. The pause lasts 2 to 4 seconds. The huntsman looks in the player's direction during this pause. Then the standard aggression behavior resumes as normal. This has been reproduced across multiple playthroughs and platforms. At lower insight levels, it does not occur. At high insight levels, it does. The most common explanation is that the huntsmen, who are themselves in a degraded mental state from extended proximity to Yharnam's blood and the Cathedral Ward's particular pressure, are registering something about a high insight player that disrupts their aggression trigger for a moment. Something recognizable in a high insight hunter that gives a mad huntsman pause. The relationship between insight and the visible amygdalae is documented. Once your insight reaches the threshold, the amygdalae that were always in Cathedral Ward become visible. But there is a specific visual transition that occurs at the exact threshold, frame by frame, that is worth examining. The amygdala do not fade in or materialize or resolve from blur. At the exact frame of the threshold, they are simply there. No transition. Full presence. The visual system does not acknowledge the transition at all. The amygdalae were there before. The game's rendering system just wasn't rendering them. And this is exactly what the game is telling you about insight. It is not that the things revealed by insight come into being. It is that you become capable of perceiving what was already present. The amygdalae on the rooftops of Cathedral Ward have been there since before the player arrived in Yharnam. The player was just not yet someone who could see them. This produces an uncomfortable implication about everything else the player cannot see at low insight levels. If the amygdalae were there all along, invisible only to insufficiently experienced perception, then the question is what else is there all along that neither the player nor any character in the game has enough insight to perceive. The game suggests an answer through its progression. As insight grows, more things become visible. The endpoint, the state of full or maximal perception, is never reached in gameplay terms. The insight cap in the game is 100, and players report that even at maximum insight, the world has not become fully transparent. Things are still hidden. The threshold for seeing everything has not been crossed. Whatever lies beyond the visible amygdalae, beyond the entities the game's progression reveals, is not something the player's achievable insight level is designed to reach. Bloodborne gives you the tool for seeing more, and then builds a world where no amount of the tool is enough to see everything. The specific cost associated with insight-granting events, the toll that witnessing great ones and entering nightmares takes on the hunter's mind, is most visible in the game's frenzy mechanic. Frenzy is a status effect that kills you from inside, building up when you're exposed to certain entities and certain spaces that exceed the human mind's ability to process. The winter lanterns inflict frenzy. The brain of Mensis inflicts frenzy at range. The amygdalae, when they grab hunters for forced nightmare transport, inflict frenzy during the transit. The common factor in all of these is that they involve contact, physical or perceptual, with something that the mind was not designed to handle. Frenzy is the mechanical expression of what exposure to the cosmic does to a human nervous system. It builds, it reaches a threshold, and then it converts directly into lethal damage. The mind cannot hold what it is seeing, and the body pays for it. What insight and frenzy together suggest is a model of human consciousness as a container with a finite capacity. Insight fills the container with understanding of things beyond the normal. Frenzy is what happens when the input rate exceeds the container's tolerance. The game is not just telling you a story about cosmic horror. It is encoding a specific theory of what cosmic horror does biologically and cognitively, one that treats the human mind as a structural element that can be overpressured by the wrong kind of information. Bloodborne's horror is not primarily emotional. It is architectural. It is about what happens to a system when it's asked to process inputs it was never designed for, and the answer is systematic failure from the inside out. The endgame transformation available to the player, the option to consume 3 umbilical cords and resist Gehrman's offer, triggering the fight with the moon presence and the subsequent transformation into a great one, is the ultimate expression of the insight economy taken to its conclusion. The transformation requires having absorbed enough of the beyond, having accumulated enough understanding of the cosmic, that the player's hunter undergoes a change of ontological category. You become something else, and the form you become is the smallest possible great one, a larval, translucent creature, tiny and apparently helpless, squirming in the grass of the hunter's dream as the dawn breaks over a sky that has never seen dawn before. You have achieved the transformation that Bloodborne's entire lore apparatus treats as the highest possible aspiration of human ambition. You have become a great one. You are an infant. You are smaller than a hand. You are in a field of flowers as the sun rises, and you have no idea what you're doing there. Whatever understanding produced this transformation, whatever accumulated insight was necessary, the result is not wisdom or power or freedom. It is the most profound vulnerability imaginable, in a form that cannot use a weapon, in a world that has not become safer. Insight led here. The costs, apparently, were not fully itemized. Chapter 11. The Church's Secret Programs. The Healing Church is the primary institutional structure of Yharnam, the organization that introduced the blood ministration program that both saved the city from disease and eventually destroyed it. The Church's history is told in fragments, across item descriptions, NPC dialogue, environmental details, and the architecture of its various facilities. And what those fragments collectively describe is not one organization, but several, a public-facing church that provides blood healing to the population and maintains the infrastructure of the city, a research apparatus operating beneath and behind that public face, and something deeper still, a third layer that even most church members may not have known about, conducting operations that would have been indefensible to every faction involved if they had been made public. The public church is well documented and reasonably well understood. It operates the Grand Cathedral, the main site of blood ministration. It employs hunters to control the beast population during hunts. It maintains the Healing Church workshop as the production centre for hunter equipment. It has a social hierarchy, a theological framework organised around Eden and the concept of the formless, and a visible presence throughout Yharnam's civic life. The blood ministration it provides genuinely works, at least initially, genuinely reducing disease and extending life. The church built its legitimacy on a real product. The catastrophe came later, as a consequence of the product's deeper nature, and the church's response to the catastrophe is the story the game tells on its surface. The second layer is the research apparatus, centered on Bergenwerth and its subsequent evolution into the various specialized branches of church scholarship. The choir, the highest and most theologically advanced branch of the church, occupies the orphanage and conducts research into ebrietas. The executioners are the church's internal enforcement arm, operating under Ligarius and maintaining the borders around Canehurst. The School of Mensis, eventually, breaks away entirely and conducts the ritual that creates the nightmare. These are the research programs, the game surfaces, the ones that have NPC representatives and area content and item descriptions attached to them. But there are item descriptions in the game that reference church programs, with no corresponding area content, NPC, or narrative presence. These are the programs the game mentions and then leaves unreachable. The most significant of these unreachable programs is the one referenced obliquely in the Communion rune description, a program involving direct contact with the Great Ones, that was conducted by a branch of the church hierarchy described only as those who sought the most complete understanding. This program is not the choir who work with Ebrietas. It is not the Mensis scholars who attempt to contact a Great One through a ritual. The description implies a group that moved beyond both of these approaches, one that sought understanding not through study of a captive entity or through ritual summons, but through something more direct. The program's outcome is not described. The group's name is not given. The item that contains this reference is a rune, which means it was transcribed from a Great One's voice at some point, which means someone who was part of this program had enough access to the Great One's mode of communication to transcribe a rune from it. The program succeeded, apparently, at the level of contact. What that contact produced is not in the description. The Thumerian descent programs, the Church's ongoing operations in the Chalice dungeons, represent a second category of institutional activity that the game documents at the margins without centering. The Church does not just archive the Chalice dungeons, it actively descends into them, maintains glyph records, conducts rituals at the dungeon altars, and extracts something from the Thumerian civilization that the dungeon architecture preserves. The nature of that extraction is partially documented. The old blood, the foundational substance of the blood ministration program, originates in the Pthumerian depths. The Church found the old blood in the dungeons and built its entire apparatus around it. But there is evidence in the item descriptions and dungeon architecture that the Church's Thumerian program involved more than extraction. There are altar states in certain Chalice dungeon rooms that indicate active ritual use within a recent time period, recent relative to the game's events, not just ancient Thumerian activity. The Church has been performing rituals in the Thumerian dungeons in the current era. What those rituals are intended to accomplish, whether they are maintaining something, summoning something, or establishing communication with something in the deeper levels, is not stated. The medical research program is the Church layer that most directly connects to the game's visible surface events. Iosefka's clinic is a Church facility. The various physicians who populate the game's NPC cast, those still functional enough to be interacted with, are Church employees operating in the medical context that serves as the Church's public face. But the medical research in the game goes significantly beyond the standard blood healing that the Church provides publicly. The transformation research, the experiments that convert human subjects into different kinds of entities, is documented in Iosefka's clinic notes and in the orphanage content. The Church is not just healing people with blood. Some portion of its research program involves determining what blood does to human form under various conditions, which means some portion of its research program involves administering blood under conditions that are not therapeutic. The Church's medical research is not distinguishable, at its deeper levels, from the experimentation the game presents as the work of its more obviously villainous characters. The line between Church physician and Church researcher doing something considerably darker than healing is not a clear line. It is a gradient, and the game's content is distributed across that gradient without marking where ordinary medical practice ends and something else begins. The connection between the Church's research programs and the Hunter Network is one of the less examined institutional relationships in Bloodborne's lore. Hunters work for the church, broadly, in the sense that they operate under church sanction during the hunts and are equipped with church-produced weapons from the church workshop. But the relationship between hunters and the church's research programs is more complicated than employment. The old hunters content in the DLC suggests that certain hunters were aware of and complicit in the church's more questionable activities, that the hunting tradition and the research tradition were not parallel programs, but intertwined ones. Certain hunters were not just pest control during the hunt nights. They were operating in service of specific research objectives. The fishing hamlet massacre, the event that caused Maria to stop hunting, was not a standard hunt against beasts. It was an operation with a specific objective related to the research program. The hunters participated. Some of them apparently continued participating in similar operations after Maria withdrew. The Healing Church's endgame situation, the state it is in during the events of the game, is one of institutional collapse managed by survivors who have no idea how far the collapse has progressed. The church's public face, the Grand Cathedral, and its environs contains enemies who are church members, clergy who have transformed into the beasts the church's hunting program was designed to suppress. The church failed at its primary function with its own staff. The Archbishop Vicar, who sits at the top of the cathedral, one of the most powerful beast entities in the base game, is the church's highest surviving representative. The institution that provided blood healing to a city and claimed to offer connection to the divine has been entirely consumed by the consequences of its own programs, from the highest levels down. The cathedral is a monument to institutional failure, so complete that even the institution's leadership is now the monster. What the church was trying to accomplish, at the level of its deepest and most hidden programs, is the question the law positions at the center of everything. The blood ministration program has a medical justification. The research programs have an exploratory justification. But the scale of the church's investment in contact with the Great Ones, the resources dedicated to ebrietas, to the mensis ritual, to the programs that have no names, suggests that the medical and exploratory justifications were never the point. They were the surface rationale for something the church could not state publicly. The church was trying to transcend the human. Not individually, not the way a hunter might become a great one at the end of their personal arc, but institutionally. The church was attempting to engineer a transition for humanity as a species, using blood as the mechanism and the Great Ones as the destination. The catastrophe is not a side effect of this project. It is the project running at a pace and producing results that the people who designed it did not survive to manage. Chapter 12. Sound Design. As lore, Bloodborne's audio design is among the most intentional in games, and in a game where so much of the narrative is conveyed through implication and environment rather than direct statement, the sound design functions as a lore delivery system as much as the item descriptions do. Composer Ryan Amon's score and the ambient audio team's work on environmental sound combine to create an acoustic world that is telling you things the visual layer isn't saying out loud. If you spend enough time listening to Bloodborne rather than just playing it, additional layers of what the game is communicating become audible. The most immediately striking audio anomaly in the game is the sound of the hunter's dream. The dream has a consistent ambient soundscape, soft wind, distant, indistinct tones that suggest music without resolving into melody. The occasional subtle sound of the doll's presence even when she's not nearby. This soundscape is designed to be safe-feeling, a deliberate contrast to the aggressive and distressing audio of Yharnam. But the dream's ambient sound, listened to carefully over an extended period, contains a recurring element that is extremely difficult to catch in real time. At irregular intervals, spaced far enough apart to avoid pattern recognition, on a short session, there is a very brief, very quiet sound that is not wind and not music. It has been described by players who identified it as resembling a breath. A single breath, barely audible, in the audio mix of a space that contains one human-presenting entity, and no reason for a breathing sound to be random rather than tied to that entity. The doll breathes. She has a breathing audio loop, but the phantom breath in the dream's ambient layer is not synchronized with the doll's position or her breathing cycle. It comes from the environment itself. The dream is breathing. The audio design of the Nightmare of Mensis uses a specific technique in its ambient layer that is distinct from every other zone in the game. Most Bloodborne zones use ambient audio that loops with intentional variation to prevent the loop from becoming perceptible. The audio engineer's art is to make the ambient sound feel continuous and organic rather than repeating. The Nightmare of Mensis's ambient audio does not do this. The Nightmare's ambient layer has an audible loop point. It is subtle, but it is there, a slight discontinuity in the ambient texture that recurs on a regular cycle. This could be simply a production oversight, but the Nightmare of Mensis is presented in the lore as an artificial space, a made thing, and the audible loop in its ambient audio is consistent with a space that was constructed rather than organically developed. The audio of the Nightmare is, like its architecture, a built thing. You can hear the seam. The sound design around the amygdala reveals something about how the game treats perception. At low insight levels, when the amygdalae in Cathedral Ward are not visible to the player, they are also not audible. There is no audio associated with them in the low insight state. At the insight threshold where they become visible, they also become audible. A very low subsonic texture that the game introduces to the Cathedral Ward's ambient mix at the moment of the visibility threshold. This subsonic element was present all along in the recording, below the standard audible frequency range for most playback systems, but the game's audio mixing attenuates it to below threshold levels at low insight and brings it up when the visual threshold is crossed. The amygdalae were not silent before you could see them. You just couldn't hear what was there to hear. The game is doing the same thing with audio that it does with visual perception. The world is not different. Your capacity to experience it is. The music of the cleric beast encounter is one of the game's most discussed pieces of scoring, in part because it is the player's first exposure to the game's musical language and establishes the template for everything that follows. But the cleric beast's music contains an element that becomes more interesting after multiple playthroughs. There is a choral passage, a layered vocal texture that resolves in a way that is structurally unusual for horror game boss music. Most boss music in the genre maintains tension and dissonance until the encounter ends. The choral resolution in the cleric beast's piece has a moment of consonance that sits in the texture for just long enough to be perceived before the harmonic language returns to the unstable. Players who have analysed this describe it as a moment of lamentation rather than threat, the music pausing to grieve the cleric beast before returning to the violence of the fight. The cleric beast is presented visually as a monster. The music, for a few seconds, makes you understand that it was something else before it became this. Ludwig's theme in the Old Hunters DLC is the most architecturally complex piece in Bloodborne's score, and the reason it is complex is that it is structurally a single piece that has been split into two states that play depending on the phase of the boss encounter. The first phase, where Ludwig has not regained his clarity of self, is chaotic, percussive, driven by an underlying rhythmic energy that resists resolution. The second phase, after Ludwig sees the holy moonlight sword and remembers who he was, shifts into a different musical mode, orchestral mournful, with the choral elements that appear throughout the game at its most spiritually significant moments. What the two-phase composition is communicating is not just a change in the boss's combat behaviour, it is a change in the boss's identity. The music is tracking Ludwig's consciousness across the encounter. When he is lost, the music is lost. When he recovers himself, the music recovers its structure. You are listening to someone remember who they are in real time while fighting them. The final boss encounter music of the third ending, the Great One form ending, where the doll cradles the infant Great One, who was the hunter, is the most unconventional piece in the game from a structural standpoint. It is quiet. For a final boss resolution sequence, it is extremely quiet. It contains no dramatic swell, no cathartic release. What it contains is an extended, gentle, almost lullaby-like passage that doesn't resolve into completion. The piece doesn't end so much as it simply stops being heard. And what this communicates musically is that the transformation the player has undergone is not a triumphant arrival. It is a beginning. The music treats the player's ascension to Great One's status as a birth rather than an apotheosis. The doll holds an infant in the dawn grass, and the music sounds like a first morning, tentative and mild, not knowing yet what the day will bring. Chapter 13. The Pthumerian Civilization and What Happened to It. The Pthumerians are the civilization that existed beneath Yharnam before Yharnam was Yharnam. They built the labyrinthine dungeon complexes that the Healing Church later descended into as the Chalice Dungeons. They maintained the old blood in rituals conducted in these complexes. They had queens, guards, priests, an architectural tradition of their own, and a relationship with the Great Ones that apparently preceded the Healing Church's relationship by an enormous span of time. The Pthumerians are presented in the game as a historical civilization, something in the archaeological past, but the Chalice Dungeons are not dead spaces. They are still active. Something is still happening down there. The Pthumerian architectural tradition, visible in the Chalice Dungeon environments, has a specific logic that reveals something about the civilization's priorities. The dungeons are not tombs. They are not archives. They are not purely defensive structures. The architecture is organized around ritual space. The dominant architectural form is the altar complex, a central ritual area surrounded by ancillary chambers that serve supporting functions, preparation rooms, material storage, approach corridors designed to produce a specific experiential sequence for whoever is walking toward the altar. The Pthumerians built their underground civilization around the practice of ritual, in a way that suggests the ritual was not just a religious activity that the civilization engaged in. The ritual was the civilization's primary function. Everything else, the living spaces, the storage, the defensive elements, was organized in service of the ritual space. The Pthumerian queens are some of the most powerful enemies in the game, and their power is specifically tied to their blood. The final boss of the conventional Chalice dungeon sequence is Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen, and the description of what she represents draws directly on the old blood lineage that the Healing Church later appropriated. Yharnam, the queen, is a vessel for the old blood in its most concentrated and ancient form. Her body is the oldest living repository of the thing the Church built its entire program around. And she is still alive in the Chalice dungeons, still present, still guarding something that the dungeon sequence positions as the ultimate discovery at its deepest level. The Pthumerians are not gone. The deepest version of them is still there, in the deepest version of the dungeons, waiting. The question of what the Pthumerian civilization experienced in its final period, the events that reduced it from an apparently sophisticated and organized civilization to the ruins that the Chalice dungeons preserve, is not answered directly. But the dungeon architecture contains clues. The later dungeon levels, the deeper ones, show signs of significant structural trauma, sections that have partially collapsed, areas where the original architectural logic has been disrupted by what appears to be force rather than decay. Something violent happened in the deeper dungeons. Something ended the Pthumerian civilization, not through gradual decline, but through an event. The nature of that event is suggested by the bosses and enemies that populate the deeper levels, the failed experiments, the entities that represent transformations gone catastrophically wrong, the Great One residue that accumulates in the dungeon's most sacred spaces. The Thumerians contacted the Great Ones. They did what the Healing Church would later attempt to do on a different scale and in a different context. They reached. Something answered. The answer was not what they were hoping for. The Thumerian civilization's technological achievement, if that word applies, was the development of the chalice ritual system itself. The chalices are not just access keys to the dungeon levels. They are tools for replicating Pthumerian ritual space, for generating new instances of the dungeon environment based on Pthumerian architectural parameters. When the Healing Church conducts chalice rituals, they are not merely entering Pthumerian ruins. They are using a Pthumerian design system to generate new ritual spaces on demand. The Pthumerians built a dungeon factory. The church found it and has been running it. The chalice dungeons that the player explores are partly ruins and partly freshly generated Thumerian designed space, and the distinction between the original and the copy is not always clear from inside the dungeon. The Pthumerian language appears throughout the dungeon environment, on walls and altars and ritual objects, and it is partially legible through the community's analysis of repeated symbols in relation to contextual objects. What has been decoded is fragmentary but suggestive. The decoded fragments tend toward the ceremonial and the cosmological, terms for the Great Ones, terms for blood and offering and descent, terms that appear to be procedural, instructions for ritual sequences. The language of the Pthumerians, as far as it has been decoded, is almost entirely dedicated to the transaction between the human and the cosmic. It is not a language for ordinary life. There is no Pthumerian word for commerce or agriculture or family that has been identified. Either those aspects of Pthumerian life used a different language system that was not preserved in the ritual spaces, or the ritual spaces are all that was preserved because the ritual spaces were all that the Thumerians considered worth preserving. The most significant Thumerian lore element that remains unresolved is the nature of the thing the Thumerian ritual system was attempting to accomplish. The Healing Church used the Old Blood for healing. The Mensis scholars used it for contact with the Great Ones. But the Thumerians were the originators, and their relationship to the Old Blood predates both of these applications. What the Thumerians were doing with the Old Blood before anyone else arrived is the question that the game builds toward in the Chalice dungeon sequence without fully answering. The deepest dungeon layers, the ones that require completing the full sequence of ritual preparation, contain enemies and architecture that suggest the Thumerian project at its most advanced was attempting something that makes the Healing Church's ambitions look conservative by comparison. The Church wanted to touch the Great Ones. The Pthumerians, it appears, wanted something more than touch. Chapter 14. The Old Hunters, DLC, and what it adds to the Foundation. The Old Hunters DLC is where Bloodborne gives its lore the most explicit expansion it receives, and what it expands is not the game's surface narrative, but its depth. The DLC does not primarily tell you new things about what is happening in Yharnam during the hunt. It tells you what happened before the hunt, who the people were who established the tradition, and what they did that made the current catastrophe not just possible, but inevitable. The Old Hunters DLC is the game's prequel made available as its epilogue, and returning to the base game after completing it is a different experience because everything you encounter on the surface carries the weight of what the DLC revealed about its origins. The Hunter's Nightmare is the DLC's primary zone, and it is worth establishing clearly what it is and how it differs from the other dream and nightmare spaces in the game. The Hunter's Nightmare is not a nightmare created by contact with a Great One, in the way the nightmare of Mensis was created. It is a nightmare created by the moon presence, specifically to contain hunters whose actions became problematic. The hunters imprisoned in the nightmare are not there because they sought the Great Ones and were punished for it. They are there because they did things during the hunts to non-beast targets that the moon presence decided needed to be removed from the surface world's history. The hunter's nightmare is a lore-covered garbage disposal. The moon presence takes the worst of what its hunters did and puts it somewhere that can't contaminate the dream it is trying to maintain. The implications of this for understanding the moon presence are significant. The moon presence is typically characterized as the entity most responsible for the hunter cycle, the thing that traps hunters in the dream and perpetuates the hunt. This characterization is accurate but incomplete. The moon presence also built a nightmare to contain hunter atrocities, to isolate the events that happened during old hunts that it apparently found unacceptable, even by the standards of an entity that runs an eternal hunting cycle. The moon presence has a threshold. Something was too much even for it. And the specific things that were too much, the actions that got hunters exiled to the hunter's nightmare, are the things the DLC allows you to see firsthand through the environmental storytelling of that zone. Lady Maria's questline in the DLC is the emotional centre of the Old Hunters content, and it is worth spending extended time on, because Maria's story is the most complete individual arc the game offers for one of its Old Hunters. Maria was Gehrman's student. She was among the most skilled hunters of her generation. She participated in the fishing hamlet operation, and at some point during or after that operation made a decision that separated her from every other hunter in the game. She stopped. She threw her weapons into a well. She renounced the hunt, and she chose to remain in the hunter's nightmare as its keeper, rather than return to a surface world where she would have to carry what she had done. The rakuyo, Maria's weapon, is described as a tool for a very special style of fighting, and its history before Maria is tied to the hunters of the sea, the fishermen who were apparently already a distinct cultural group with their own traditions before the healing church arrived. Maria found the rakuyo and used it, and then she threw it in a well rather than continue. The weapon is still there. You retrieve it from the well. You use it to fight the Phantom of Maria in the Astral Clock Tower. And in that fight you are fighting someone who has been waiting to be stopped. Someone who has stayed in the nightmare long after she could have moved on because she felt she owed a penance that never quite ran out. Maria is the game's most explicit portrait of guilt in the Hunter class, and she is important specifically because her guilt is about something specific. She knows what she did. She chose to stay in consequence of it. Most of the old hunters in the nightmare are there because something was done to them, because the nightmare caught them without their consent. Maria is there by choice. The distinction says everything about the difference between the hunters who lost themselves in the hunt and the hunters who retained enough of themselves to know when they had done something unforgivable. The fishing hamlet itself, the zone at the end of the DLC, is the destination the entire DLC has been pointing toward. It is where the specific wrong was committed that sent certain hunters to the nightmare. And what the fishing hamlet reveals through its environmental storytelling and its item descriptions is that the community living there had a relationship with the cosmic that predated the Healing Church's program and was completely independent of it. The fishermen of the hamlet had access to something, a great one, presence in their coastal waters, and they had developed their own set of practices around that presence. They were not experimenting. They were not attempting to transcend. They were living in proximity to something vast, navigating a relationship with it, on their own terms, in their own way. And the Healing Church came and decided that what the fishermen had was something the church needed. And they took it. And the hunters who took it for them were sent to the nightmare because of how they took it. The entity whose presence the fishing hamlet had been cultivating, the Great One in the waters, is never named or shown directly in the DLC, but the items associated with the hamlet and the descriptions of what the church extracted from the fishermen suggest that what the hamlet had was a form of relationship with a Great One that the church wanted for its own research purposes, specifically the choir's research into the upper reaches of the Great One's domain. The fisherman had something the church's formal research apparatus, with all its resources and scholarship and dedicated facilities, did not have: a genuine, long-term, mutually acknowledged relationship with a cosmic entity. The church came and destroyed it. The hunters who did the destroying knew what they were doing and did it anyway, and the moon presence decided that this particular act was something it needed to put in a box and put away. The astral clock tower, where Maria's phantom presides, is a location that the DLC doesn't fully explain, despite spending considerable time in it. The tower exists in the hunter's nightmare, but its relationship to the surface world is unclear. There are patients in the tower, entities that were apparently once human and have been subjected to research of a kind that the game presents as the worst of what the church's medical programs were capable of. These patients are not beasts, they are not fully human. They are transformations that were conducted on people who, by the evidence of their present state, did not agree to what was done to them. The church research in the astral clock tower represents the program that the church's publicly acceptable medical face was fronting for, and the patients in the tower are the product of what happened when church researchers stopped being constrained by any consideration of patient welfare. Maria is their keeper too, in a sense. She keeps watch over the worst of what the church did, in the place the moon presence built to hold it, because Maria participated in the church's worst actions, and feels the weight of that participation. The hunter's nightmare's endgame enemy, Lawrence, the first vicar, is a boss that presents a profound historical irony. Lawrence was the founder of the Healing Church, the person who took what Byrgenwerth had discovered about the old blood and formalized it into a public institution, who built the medical apparatus that defined Yharnam society, who made the blood ministration program into something the city accepted and depended on. Lawrence is, in the conventional institutional sense, the most consequential human being in Yharnam's history.